It's a pretty rough gospel this morning, huh? Christian mission is a serious thing, and it involves cost and courage. I want to talk to you this morning about that gospel, and I want to suggest that the apostles were crackpots. I'll come back to that in a few minutes, but I just want to put that in place for now. This is Matthew's account of the sending of the 12 on mission, and it's best understood in a couple of contexts. The gospel event is set in the context of Jesus' earthly ministry. Jesus commissions and sends the apostles, instructing them on what threats they will face and how to deal with it. It's kind of a manual in mission, if you will. Jesus sends them to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not to the Gentiles, not to the Samaritans, but only to those Judeans who were out of the good graces of the Pharisees, of the establishment, of the religious establishment. Matthew's gospel is the most Hebraic of the gospels, of the synoptic gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It was most attuned to the issues among the Jewish culture at the time. The concern was that the prophetic image of Israel as a light to the nations and the glory of God evident on earth was not to be lost, and that the Jewish faith community needed to be called back to that. In other words, Jesus says, go to the unchurched, or the people who are turned off by what they see in religion and have given up on it. Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, the mission is urgent, and because the expectation was that the world was coming to an end, it was especially urgent. The last phrase in this gospel, you may have noticed, was, you will not have made your way through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Judgment was coming, and it was urgent. As I said, this gospel is kind of a manual for mission. Difficulty and foreboding face the apostles. Their future holds rejection, persecution, probable death. They are to proclaim the kingdom of God, to teach and to preach, and to bring healing to a broken world. They're going out to a hostile world where ethnic and social and religious divisions are abundant. And their very message will, in fact, provoke division and enmity in families. They will bear the brunt of that. Some of the divisions that mentioned in the gospel today are kind of ironic and not very encouraging on a Father's Day. And the gospel for next week includes more of the same. Jesus was doing a new thing, calling Israel back to its roots, to a new vision of the kingdom that would cause controversy and contentiousness. That was the situation in Jesus' own time, being sent to a culture that was primarily Judaic. But then there's another context for this gospel as well. You see, while Matthew's gospel looks at the time of Jesus, it was in fact generated from various oral traditions and from the earlier gospel of Mark, coming into something of its final form toward the end of the first century, probably sometime between 80 or 90 CE. So it was finally formulated well after the crucifixion and the resurrection, which happened in the 30s, and well after Mark's gospel, which dates from the 60s. So the other context for this passage is the late first century, in a time when the Christian community was not embryonic, not based in a small band of apostles, but rather was seen as a spreading sect within Judaism and an object of scorn and persecution by Roman occupiers in Palestine. The dangers inherent in Christian mission were just as prevalent, but the focus of mission had changed. At that time, not only the lost sheep of the house of Israel were the focus, but rather Gentiles, Samaritans, Roman oppressors, and the whole society and culture that surrounded it. The last chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the 28th chapter, contains the Great Commission, which set different goals. It says, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." The mission remained the same, to bring hope and healing to a suffering world based on the love of God seen in Jesus. This new Israel, founded in Jesus, becomes the mission, and that mission remains the same in our own day, as vastly different as are the context and challenges of our own culture and our own time. Jesus sends his apostles out as sheep in the midst of wolves. They need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves to succeed, to be without guile, but to be realistic about the realities they face and the world they face. This struggling and seemingly powerless endeavor was based on people whose primary resource was their faith, their resilience, their tenacity, and those who were willing to rely on the Spirit of God sustaining and empowering them for mission. So the heart of this gospel lesson, I think, is that it's not in power or prominence, in wealth or knowledge that things are transformed, but rather in believing that your efforts matter and having faith that God prospers whatever feeble attempts we might make in spite of our limitations. And I think that's the good news beneath all the threatening, tough stuff in the gospel today. So let's look at that list of apostles in this gospel, not one by one, but as a group. They were the laborers in the harvest, but very unlikely people to change the world. These are not the best and the brightest, not the powerful and the astute, not the wealthy and the sophisticated. They are, in fact, simple fisher folk. One, a despised tax collector. Uneducated people, perhaps with broken lives and broken hearts. Peter seemed a leader and strong, but he fell apart under pressure and denied Jesus when the chips were down. Judas, in the end, betrayed him. All of them, over the course of Jesus' ministry, managed to misinterpret or fail to understand what he was up to. Now, if you have a tough job, we all know you try to find the best people possible to help you do it. And Jesus seems to find limited and broken people with a past or with a problem. I sometimes think Jesus could have benefited mightily from those online services that match computers, CVs with a job description. Unfortunately not available. But to these people, to these apostles, he entrusts the message of the kingdom and the work of healing and restoring and reconciling and caring. These people had no special attributes, but were people who were real, who understand what it meant to hurt and to know limits. They were drawn to Jesus and his message, and they found hope for themselves and their life in it. That was their primary attribute. And maybe Jesus, again, like I said, would have benefited from an online hiring service. Jesus chooses people who know what it's like to struggle, and he sends them to take hope to others. He asks them to discern where the heart of faith resided in the communities they encountered. In most situations, accomplishment, prestige, prominence, and promotions are the measure of success. This gospel is not an excuse for mediocrity or doing poorly. We're called to give the best we can, but it's important to know limitations, and most of all, to trust God's love and God's valuing of people that is based on standards unlike those that are common to us and the world we live in. So, I want to come back. Were the apostles crackpots to get into this venture, for taking on such a mission? Well, I have a story about that. It's a story from India, a fable about water pots. There was a water bearer in India who had two large pots, each hung on the end of a pole that he carried across his neck and shoulders. Now, one of the pots had a crack in it, and the other pot was perfect and always delivered a full portion of water at the end of the long walk from the stream to the master's house that this servant would trek. The cracked pot arrived only half full. For 2 years, this situation went on, with the bearer delivering only 1.5 pots of water to his master's house each day. Of course, the perfect pot was proud of its accomplishments, perfect to the end for which it was made. But the poor cracked pot was ashamed of its imperfection and miserable that it was able to accomplish only half of what it had been made to do. After 2 years of what it perceived to be bitter failure, the cracked pot spoke to the water bearer one day by the stream. And he said, "I'm ashamed of myself. I want to apologize." "Why?" the water bearer asked. "What are you ashamed of?" "Well," the cracked pot said, "I've been able for these past 2 years to deliver only half my load because this crack in my side causes water to leak out all the way back to your master's house. Because of my flaws, you have all of this work, you have to do all of this work, and you don't get the full value from your efforts." The water bearer felt sorry for the old crackpot, and in his compassion he said, "As we return to the master's house today, I want you to notice the beautiful wild flowers on the side of the path." And the crackpot was cheered somewhat by that, but at the end of the trail it still felt bad because it had leaked out half of its load. And so again it apologized to the bearer for its failure. And the bearer said to the pot, "Did you notice that there were flowers only on your side of the path, but not on the other pot's side? That's because I've always known about your flaw, and I took advantage of it. I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day while we walked back from the stream, you've watered them. For 2 years, I've been able to pick these beautiful flowers to decorate my master's table. And without you being just the way you are, he would not have this beauty to grace his house." Each of us has our own unique flaws, and in some ways, we're all cracked pots. In God's great economy, nothing goes to waste. It's not that we seek cracks and brokenness, not that we're proud of them or cease to do our best. It is to recognize that God's vision and God's economy is very different. Even in brokenness and limitation, there is value and blessing and unseen potential. God is not glorified by perfection, but by human striving in faith and love to know and understand and to care for others. So the good news of the kingdom is in part that God sees our cracks, our confusion, our hurried and frantic ways, our limitations, and our brokenness, and has compassion. But more than that, when we in faith put ourselves at God's disposal, we are agents, both with our gifts and our limitations, of God's love and compassion and care for a hurting and confused world. The harvest is plentiful, and by God's grace, we too can be ones to joyfully declare a kingdom of love and of redemption.